In preparation for doing a lot of the work that we hope to do on this new home, one of the things we needed to do was to have control over the electrical process. And to do that, of course, in my state, needed to have the license. So one of the things I had to do was to prepare to take the Wisconsin Master Electrician exam. And I thought I'd take a moment to describe the approach that I took to it. Of course, the Mike Holt books are quite valuable in this, and here's the one from the 2020 NEC. Interestingly enough, with the 2017 code is still operable here in Wisconsin, but this got me close enough, and you can find many of the materials, I think, that you would find quite interesting. It's nicely arranged, well illustrated, and one of the things that I like about this particular approach is you get the examples on a page like this one, and then almost immediately after it, you'll get some actually tests or small sample tests that you can go through for doing the calculations. And then you can check your work and see if you understand the approach that they're taking to it. It's really quite good. Towards the end of the book, there are a number of exams, and they're nicely arranged. They're arranged in straight order. In other words, this is an exam here on sections 430 to 525, and they're actually in the order in which you would find them. And the very next test will be one that's in random order. And the purpose of these small little exams or quizzes is to help you to learn to navigate the NEC itself and learn that quite well. I actually found this really helpful. One of the things, if I were the editor of this book, one of the things I would do to improve it, I think, is there's lots of these calculations in here within the book, but not many of the calculations end up in the practice quizzes in the back of the book. And I wish that there were more of those in the back of the Mike Holt books. Nevertheless, a terrific resource. The next thing that I think was helpful in this is, of course, the code book itself. Maybe that should have been first in here. And if people who are preparing haven't already done it, paying for the colored tabs on the side of this is super interesting. But then the question, of course, is how to use it well. And this is an example of the way I marked up the book as I used it. And you'll see a few things that I tried to do. One of them, of course, is use a yellow highlighter, which is quite useful. But when I was actually trying to get my head around finding data in a hurry when the exam was asking for it, I often found myself looking for numbers. Is it more than 6 inches or less than 6 inches? Is it over 800 amps or under 800 amps? And so one of the things I started to do was to actually circle all of the key numbers as they came up in orange. It just made it a lot easier to find what I was looking for. In this particular case, appliance loads, was it 75%? Was it 4 more appliances? I could search it and find it, but to have the numbers circled was super helpful for me. One of the other things I did is I used pink or a different color to highlight when I was changing or where the code changes its concepts. And so, for instance, in this case, we're talking about electrical cooking appliances in dwelling units, and then up here is other than dwelling units, and helped me to make sure as I was flipping through the code that it, in fact, I'm aware of where I pull the standard out or where I put a number out, because what I want to make sure of is that 70%, does that 70% apply? What section am I in? And these pink highlights allowed me to see differences, or sometimes it says except, I might have highlighted that, and you can see how that might go. And then, of course, in Wisconsin, there are adjustments, and I'm sure there are in many other municipalities as well. So I would write the actual code reference in the Wisconsin changes, and the way they change or define supervision in this case. There might be other rules. Wisconsin has a fairly substantial amount of changes around septic systems, interestingly enough, which is quite helpful. So the last thing I would do is some reminders to myself, things like overcurrent devices. In this particular section, use the next size up rule, which doesn't apply exactly everywhere. Now, the last thing I did in terms of marking up my book is there are a few places that I went over and over and over again. And so in addition to the tabs, I actually added my own tabs. To do this, I just used a label maker and created a label. So there's a lot of times where clearances were important, and I might want to go there. What was this one here? Ground cover is a thing that showed up over and over, And so I wanted to be able to very quickly find the ground cover reference. The last thing I did in this book is I spent a lot of time in the index. I've talked with people who much prefer the table of contents. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I made it much faster. If I were really interested in clearances, for instance, I could go to the C tab quite quickly and find it. I also would sometimes in the index mark up areas where, like, this whole section was on branch circuits, and it was a lot easier to find sometimes if I would just highlight it. So those are some of the things that I found really helpful in that particular book. Now, from a learning perspective, one of the things that I did was, back to the Holt book, I would actually go through a section of the Holt book, and we'll try to find one of these in here that might be particularly useful. So for instance here, just reminding myself that horsepower was the output watts divided by 746. Here's raceway calculations. But to read it is one thing, to apply it is altogether another thing. And so what I did from a learning mechanism perspective is I tried to build spreadsheets that would actually help me to identify, or to learn the process. If I could teach the process to myself, I could learn it. And I'll put the link to where those are. But here, for instance, I created neutral load calculations. And so in these blue boxes, I could enter the values. Now, of course, I can't actually take the computer with me into the exam, but I can take the example calculation with me into the exam, which is what this book is here. And so I could fill it out. And what I would try to do is to build the spreadsheet in such a way that you could, in fact, that I could, in fact, start to get into my head how the code works. And in many cases, there are many exceptions. And you can see the red text. This one's very, very hard to see because it's so small. But there's red text here, which reminds me that there is an exception in the code that I might have to follow. And the fact that I had to try to build these spreadsheets in order to understand how the code might work got me deeper into an understanding of the thought process that might apply as we go forward into some of these. And remember, of course, there's some cases where you just want to remember basic principles, like non-continuous load plus 125% of the continuous load is a key element that you really want to get in your head as you go. I'll put a link to the spreadsheets that I created, but just as a reminder, the concept here is not so much that the spreadsheets are of value themselves, but the process of creating those spreadsheets is super interesting. The other thing that I did is I walked through the table of contents, and I recreated the table of contents in a more visual way. Of course, the table of contents of the NEC is by itself quite useful, and you would find many people who say, Paul, I don't understand, the table of contents is terrific, why don't you just use it? And the answer to that is, well, I found this to be a lot harder to look at than this. And so I could very quickly, for instance, in chapter 3, which is around wiring methods, and here's chapter 3 in the code book. Yeah, this is pretty readable, but I found it much easier for me to kind of say, okay, I'm getting, in 310, I have the basic stuff around general conductors and devices. Throughout this, then, I could very quickly, if the test question or if the application in reality were about, I don't know, PVC, I should know, okay, that's in 352, and I could very quickly move to 352. I did that for each of these chapters, and it was quite helpful for me as I started to think through what are the special conditions, what can I turn to quickly as I needed to. And I found I went a lot into chapter 2, which is all about wiring and protection, a color-coded green, everything that's related to grounding and bonding, because that shows up throughout the exam. And I also noted, by the way, with these green dots, when I did this, that the green dots actually refer to sections that also make reference to grounding and bonding, and we might want to pay attention to at some point in the future. So that was another thing I did to begin to prepare to take this exam. And you might find that table of contents useful or not useful. Now, the third thing I did is, or I don't know if it's the third or fourth, is I have found, as I mentioned before, I wished that there were more things in the Holt book, or more examples back here in the test questions that matched some of the calculations questions that you see in the rest of the book. And I found that these folks at SnapZ Electrical License Prep to be quite helpful. You can see this on the tools here, and you can see they have a whole lot more example tests that you might be able to go through, and they have some speed tests and a few other things you might find helpful. I understand from them that they're great partners with the folks from Holt, which is terrific, and that might be quite useful to you. I did have a PDF version of the NEC handbook. It was really helpful in places where I didn't understand the code as it was written, and it helped to interpret a little bit. I have to say I didn't use it a lot. I'm not sure I would pay for it again, but I think it was useful for interpreting some sections that weren't totally clear. There's also this book, this illustrated guide to the NEC. This had some nice illustrations that augmented the Holt book and others. I found it was really helpful in understanding areas that weren't clear to me. But again, I'm not sure I would buy it again. I think that between Holt, the NEC book itself, and my own sort of recreation of what the NEC was saying to sort of cement it in my mind was the most useful. One of the things I would highly, highly recommend is if you were to go to Appendix D in your NEC, here's Appendix D, and you can see, by the way, how the tabs help you to go quickly there. Walking through these examples and making sure you can reproduce the numbers in these examples was super, super helpful to me. A lot of people talked a lot about this little guy, the Uglies Guide to Electrical References. I bought it because everybody was so excited about it, but everything that's in here is also in the code book. This might just be a very easy way, something you have in your truck or in your back pocket in case you need to look something up. I didn't find it particularly helpful for exam prep. So in Wisconsin, a couple of things you might want to know. If you're not from Wisconsin, you can skip to the end here. In Wisconsin, the journeyman exam is largely about looking things up in the code book. So it's essentially the Holt book will be really good in all of the various search tests you have in the back of the Holt book will be super helpful. The master exam is mostly about calculations, and that's where I found the SnapZ to be helpful in my preparation. It's a 50-question test over 4 hours. You can bring any resources you want. The only rule is that it has to be bound, and sticking sheets of paper into something like this, even a 3-ring binder, is acceptable in Wisconsin. It just can't be loose paper all over the place. And then, of course, if you pass, then you'll have the opportunity to apply for the license as a separate act. So that's what I did to prepare. Hope everything is useful to you. If not, let me know in the comments, and I'll be more than happy to augment the work that I did here to have it be improved with your comments. Thanks again.